don't get on Google and rate the church. Don't even go on Google and give your church a 5-star rating, because that's still being consumeristic. Keep it sacred. Keep holy things sacred. Don't treat your church like a brand. Set it apart. Set it apart.
All right, listeners, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast, which we aim to give you really practical wisdom and insights in how to lead your church today to really aligning back to personal ownership of the Great Commission. Aaron's not with us this week, but I'm excited to introduce you to a new friend, Chris Palmer. Chris, say hi to our listeners, please.
Doug, it's so good to be with you and Intentional Churches. You were just with us a couple of days ago, so it's good to see your face again.
Yeah, you too, man. You too. Will you, for our listeners, just give it a high-level overview of your story and background, and especially just, kind of your expertise, if you would.
Yeah, I am officially, since July 1st, the Dean of Ministry and Theology here at Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida, in Central Florida. I have my PhD in Biblical Studies, where I studied Pentecostal theology as well as the Book of Revelation, and something called theodicy, which is an exploration of the goodness of God and the reality and the existence of suffering. I did that at Bangor University in the UK. And it's just great to be in Florida, in Southeastern, serving our students and being with them every day on campus.
Well, man, July, that's a pretty new to the role, but what are a couple things you're learning pretty quickly about ministry students today? Give us kind of some.
Yeah, I think at a very practical level, it's amazing to see, on one hand, how much ministry is still the same as when I was in Bible school 20 years ago. But then on the other hand, I think it's amazing to see how much has changed in ministry. And so there's a uniqueness to that where I get to look back on what things were like for me and invest in the students from that level, but also to learn from the students and see where their unique context and location has brought them. All of our students were in high school during the pandemic. And so I think that's affected them in different ways and has affected their ideas of church and how church is to be done. And I think that might speak to a little bit of our conversation where we're going today, but it really is an interesting time. Things are moving really quick. We're doing our best to keep up with that.
Yeah, I just love the creativity of Southeastern and the way you guys are really getting out of the box on how to deliver really good theological training. So today we're talking about a topic that I'm going to guess most church leaders are not. It's kind of a negative topic. So I'm sorry in advance, man, that I've got you on here for this, but I think you can give some great insight. And that is this season, we've really been dealing with this idea of, we're using the word radical alignment back to personal ownership of the Great Commission. And to say that would mean that, of course, we think there's misalignment in a lot of our congregations, our staff's leadership. And so the topic we want to cover today is this idea of Christian consumerism, which is kind of a buzzword. It gets thrown around a lot. But I think let's start off the conversation. Like, how would you define, especially in America, Christian consumerism for our listeners?
Well, I think we'd start with the word consumerism, which would be the consumption of goods at a pace or scale to where you feel that that's what makes your life better. We would say in vernacular, keeping up with the Joneses. I don't know if the young people still use that, but my parents certainly did. And it's the idea that consuming or buying things or adding things to my life is actually going to make my life better. Or add to me status or whatever it is I think it's going to do, but it's putting faith in that being a very foundational part of your life. And so Christian consumerism would be that sort of mentality taking place in Christianity or evangelical Christianity, and more so how we're going to talk about it today, being a methodology that is employed by the local church in order to evangelize in particular.
Say more. What do you mean by methodology?
Well, it would be the idea that, and this is not to talk negatively, but this is what it really is that, hey, our church has, or our ministry has, whatever it is that you need, and that itch that you've been looking to scratch can be fulfilled at our church. And we have a long list of supplies that we can provide for you to really find whatever it is that you need at the church. And so in coming to the church, this was something that developed, I would say. I began to notice it probably in the 90s, maybe the mid 90s, the early 90s, where the methods that churches took to evangelize or to reach the lost was to really cater to the lost. There's an old saying that says, if you're going to, what you use to win them is what you're going to have to use to keep them. And so that was, hey, let's cater to what people are in the market for. And so growing families in the 90s and the 2000s that weren't interested in church, what they were interested in were consumable goods. And so when these consumable goods and these consumable services that were of interest to individuals began to be used by churches to approach them, churches became consumeristic. That's a word. A place of consumerism takes place, and so that sort of began to be the approach. And so it's had ramifications and consequences that we could probably talk about from this perspective. But from the long range, it was appealing to people's desire to consume goods with offering what they were in the market for. That was something that I saw taking place, really in particular in the mid 90s, I think, and throughout.
Yeah, I appreciate you wanting to case it and not wanting to be negative, but I really do think we need a real kind of smack in the face as church leaders, because I think what you're saying is very true. I think a lot of church leaders would blame the sheep, would blame our congregations, but what I hear you saying is the inverse actually may be true and more to blame, in that we went down this road. I oftentimes use the phrase the programmatic church, which sounds like very neutral. But when you begin to offer a ministry buffet of services, you inadvertently or subconsciously are telling people, come to the church to consume. And so I just appreciate how you're saying that. But it's fascinating for me to think about the fact that we actually, as church leaders, probably had as much to do with our congregations going here as them themselves. So I think in the modern church, if we sit, the 80s, 90s programmatic church, I often talk about, like, if you had, you kind of were going down this road, if you had sports ministries and you had a lot of para church things like MOPS and Awana and all these things that we were offering. How would you, for our listeners, how would you talk about, how do you diagnose signs of Christian consumerism in modern day church? Like, what would be symptoms or signs that we would see in our churches?
Yeah, I think it's kind of going back just a little bit to your question to answer this one. It really is, there's an old term, the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, that, and what the church has to be very careful is that it remains the church, and it remains, if you will, weird, or it remains an oddity, because the power in the local congregation is that it is something different from the community that it serves. It's a place where you go to do your deep reflection of the numinous and of the divine. And that is not successful or can't be accomplished when the numinous or the divine looks like the spirit of the age that's around it. And so that, I think, is one step that was made, one misstep that was made back when this began to take place and churches began to be consumeristic, is that instead of seeing the price of following Christ and Christianity as something that's costly, I think it really lowered the bar of what it means to follow Christ and to contemplate and reflect on Christ in order to cater to what was the zeitgeist of the age, and that was having consumerism, or goods and services that catered to what a comfortable society that really wasn't finding itself in the throes of oppression and tyranny, and to cater to them. And so that, I think what started to happen is that instead of saying, hey, like Bonhoeffer said, come follow Christ who bids you to die, or this idea of the cross, which was cruciform, is that I'm taking my good life that I have, because in my good life, I can't find meaning. I can't find purpose, even as good as it is, until I actually lay it down and give it to Christ And it kind of shifted away from that. And that's when I remember a particular ministry I knew of took the cross down. They didn't want any visibility of the cross. They didn't really want these outward things that had to do with Christianity. And they were saying, we're going to reach the lost. We don't want to scare them off with that. But what we're going to put up front is not the cross. What we're going to put up front is not our programs. We're going to put up front, hey, did you know you can come here and there's a coffee shop for you? Yeah, you can listen to our sermon and you can have a cappuccino. You know what we have for you? We have the finest water slide in town. Yes, we have a water slide in the church. We have go-kart camp for you all.
Yes.
We have 27 different ministries for children, and they saw that as being effective. In what I think ended up happening is, so there was all these things being offered, and it created this, I think, entitlement inside of individuals that they were expecting these sorts of things, and what is consumable is also disposable. And when it no longer was meeting their consumeristic needs, people started to take up the term church shop. I'm going church shopping. I'm going to find the church that is exactly right for me. And when you go to the church, well, what are you looking for? It was supposed to be a place where you could sit and reflect on the most profound times of your life: death, life, marriage, birth, the things that really, when we stop and think about them, they're beyond us, and we need a place that's holy, and we need a place that is sacred. And it didn't become that. It became, let's turn it into, Christian Walmart. And we need to make sure that our kids' snacks are gluten-free. And I mean, I've had pastors tell me, how dare the children's pastor give our kids snacks that have gluten in them? And it's to the point where you'd think they're handing the kids poison. I mean, it was that deep, and thought about leaving the church because the children's pastors handing out suckers afterwards, where we used to eat those and they didn't kill us. And so, but there's a sense of entitlement that has come from being consumeristic, where everyone feels they're owed everything. And my concern is that the church has not become, or has ceased to become, a place of reflection. It has become like all of the one-stop shop places in town. And if the church doesn't have that, well, it's just a lesser church in the area. And I think that's where we find ourselves today.
Wow, man, I think you said such good stuff in that little bit there. And I do think the entitlement thing that you said, the phrase, what is consumable is disposable. And I just think that is so true, and highlighted by, I'm not going to say the word, but 2020, where we saw it in all of its glory, an entire generation or two that were so focused on church being consumable that it led to this massive reshuffling, if you will, of congregations, and a lot of pain and hurt in the pastorate. Are there tangible things that a church leader should be paying attention to that they would see these types of behaviors in themselves or their people that would indicate consumerism is pretty rampant in their church? Because in my experience, as we travel the country and interact with church leaders, oftentimes I feel like this is the model you're talking about was such a subconscious. We weren't thinking deeply about the unintended consequences of the programmatic church. And even, I would argue, digital strategies through COVID, where it actually fed the consumeristic animal even more of our congregations. Are there tangible things that a church leader should be paying attention to know if they're accidentally going here? Because nobody in the previous generation intended to do this. I was a part of leading a church like this. We didn't intend to do this.
I think it's something we all kind of slipped our way into and didn't necessarily wake up one day and say, you know what, we don't want the cross anymore. It really wasn't that. It was more subtle than that. I think that maybe the end game was the same, but the means actually ended up becoming the end. And success kept us from wanting to owe up to what that was taking place. Yes, to answer your question, I think that if we really take an honest assessment of ourselves and determine that we become production driven and production oriented, in the focus of our task and our energies is to build more productions versus building people, I think then we have a problem. So if it's programs, productions over producing people, then I think we're slipping into that. Another thing is people pleasing. We're here to please the Lord. And it's simple as that. But why are we doing all these things? Is it really to please people? And I know that there's some efficiency that we want to have, but if it really is to please people and to cater to everybody's needs, it's not the responsibility of the pastor and the leadership to cater to everybody's needs. We'll eventually wear ourselves out. And even doing that doesn't form people in the shape of the cross. It doesn't form people to be followers of Jesus because we give them everything that society and the world is giving them. We should have a focus on catechizing our people, or another way of saying is making disciples of our people and leading them to understand how to read Scripture, how to follow the Holy Spirit, how to walk in love and unity with each other, versus just giving them everything that they want and making productions that are jaw-dropping. So I think those are some signs here. And if you do that, you could look at what happens to the people. One of the funny things you can do when you go online is read people what they say, the Yelp reviews that they give churches, and how they, what they have to say about those kinds of things. They treat it like it's a restaurant, or they treat it like it's an Amazon product. And we've kind of we have that Amazon mentality where we come in and say, oh, well, the music's too loud. 1 star off. Oh, there's a hole in the carpet. Can never come to church with a hole in the carpet. Those are things that if your people have the mentality, it's widespread. It could be a problem with what's taking place in the ministry.
Yeah. And I think that's the first, as we turn the corner into, let's help our listeners say, how are we going to lead differently? But I think that's one of the key factors, is understanding most of us are just implementing plays and strategies that we've either copied. We call it the silver bullet mentality, where you just ran off and looked at somebody else's model and tried to implement that there without understanding the true theological, ecclesiological, and missiological implications of that thing. We often talk about I do a lot about the institutional mindset and how the American church is basically created in the professional pastorate. Like, we've created a modernized version of the Constantinian church. It just has different appeals on the outside of it. I don't know. What do you think about that before we turn to how we're going to help each other get out of this kind of rut?
Yeah, in the sense of that it starts to look like the world and everything around it. And I think that's absolutely the case. I'll give you a story that I was thinking about this weekend in preparation for this podcast that really, really drew me back. And actually, it's a reflection I hadn't really thought about in this way. I remember there was a very busy time in my life where I didn't really have much time to sit and contemplate Scripture, the Lord, my life, what my life means, the bigger and higher questions that all of us have. We all deal with those in different ways, whether we back them off or deny God's existence or kind of accept agnosticism. And I remember that I was passing the hospital, and I just had this prompting, like, I need some time to clear my head. I drove into the hospital, and I went into the hospital chapel, and it was about 7:00 in the evening, and it was around Christmas time. And I sat in the hospital chapel, and it was a Catholic hospital. So, it was best I could find at that minute, and I'm sitting there, and there's nothing fancy about it. I'm sitting looking at a stained glass, but I have this moment for about an hour where I'm drawn into prayer. I'm drawn into thinking about the Lord. And it was the most meaningful thing that I had experienced in my life, in the busyness of it, that drew me really back to a time where I was considering God and all the things that refreshed my soul. And I think like that's a great example. It was precise. What drew me to that chapel was precisely that it wasn't everything else that the world was giving me at that time. There were no programs. There was no cool pastor wearing torn jeans. There was no smoke fog machines and lights, and there was no production. It was just me, an individual who was searching had deep reflection, and I'm sitting there thinking about the cross and thinking about, the divine. And that's what gives our church power. It's the more unlike the world we are, it seems that the more we thrive. I mean, that is exactly what's taking place in Iran at the moment, and in China, where these underground churches, and they're not the Constantinian models. It's not the enforced religion of the day on everybody. And because of that, it gives it its weirdness. It gives it its uniqueness. And it really gives it its power. What people want is not what they get every day, I think.
Can you say more just about what's happening in the church in Iran and China? I've not heard much about this.
Yeah, there is just tremendous growth in the church. I mean, obviously, China is a communist country, and Iran is a Muslim country. And so they don't get to have, there's no proselytizing that's taking place. It would seem that in China, that to do any proselytizing would be to seem that they're subverting the government, and it's seen as a political movement. So that would be persecuted. But yet the church is growing and is expanding. And the reason it's able to do that is because it's not a national brand. It's not a national brand. It's not a statewide brand. It is not a corporate brand. It's something that is genuinely taking place between individuals, and and the cost is high. It's not cheapened through consumerism. So I think that when the buy-in is high, people are invested. When the buy-in is low, people aren't invested. And the problem with the consumerist church is that the buy-in was really low. Like, what did it actually mean to be a disciple? What did it really mean to give your life to Christ and follow him at any cost? You can do that with a frothy mocha in your hand on Sunday morning and not have to be confronted with your lifestyle that that you had, the way that you're treating your spouse, the way that you're treating your wife, your husband, you weren't there with your kids. I mean, we don't want to offend you, but you just keep sipping that, and eventually you'll come around. And I think the buy-in was pretty low in those times. Not saying that some things weren't effective, but I think we're seeing the result of that today.
That is helpful. Thanks for sharing that. I've heard traditionally stories about the church expanding in China, but I had not heard about it in Iran. I heard you list in there one definitive strategy for our listeners, and that is, are we giving people quiet space to contemplate kind of the big questions of life? Yes. Are there other things in your mind practically that a church leader can do to help return? One of our good friends used this phrase, return the church back to the people. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, instead of being the priest, modern day priests, our staff and all that, how do we return it back to people? So you have other practical tips about how you would coach our listeners?
I think another thing is that this kind of speaks to the entitlement, but encourage your people to serve at all costs. I mean, nothing really eliminates entitlement than serving. People in the church should serve, but I don't think it should be serve a production all the time. But I think should be serve your community and serve the people that are part of your church. For instance, if you find out that there's an individual in your church who is moving, and they don't have the means and the financial ability and the logistics to move, a church should gather around that person, and that 5-6 people should go and move that person out of the house. Or, if you find out that there's somebody who is struggling on Thanksgiving, go serve that person. These types of things really remind us why we congregate. We congregate because we're not trying to, have the biggest show in town. We congregate because there are people in us that are hurting and we need each other. And that was the heart of Christ, is to lay our lives down. So giving people in your community or in your church that you're serving opportunities to lay their lives down in a way that isn't always visible or always seen, but is seen by God. I think that really begins to eliminate the entitlement that's there. Number 3 is to accept imperfection as something that is beautiful. Church is not going to be able to get,
man, you're stepping in it now, because the value of Excellence is thrown around a ton in leadership circles.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's definitely that honor culture where excellence is. We want to make this thing. I mean, literally, we want to make it work like Disney World. We're reading books about how Disney has the tunnels under it, and how we don't see anybody we don't see the cast out of character at any time. But that's fantasy land, and perfect. I think perfection makes us all a little bit nihilistic at times when we kind of because we're not in the perfect right now. And so when we come together in our communities, Paul left the church at Ephesus and basically told them, "Hey, work it out amongst yourselves." And there's this constant working out that takes place amongst us as we move on to the perfect. Well, as that takes place, that means there's going to be times where the worship team blows it. There's going to be times where you hear a wrong note. There are going to be times where you come in and the coffee is cold, and the pastor's in a bad mood and he doesn't want to shake anybody's hand and he's bickering with his wife, and these kind of things are going to happen where you don't get your parking spot, it's just going to happen. And there's a church right now. Well, it's not a church I go to here in Lakeland, I should say, and they're doing what God's called them to do, and the parking lot is really a mess. But they're growing, but the parking lot's a mess. And you have one of two decisions when you come in. You could say, "I can't believe this parking lot, man. It takes me time to get in and get out. I have to go home." And I think all of us are grumpy leaving church anyway because all of our blood sugar is low in the first place, But but you could be grumpy, or you could say, "Hey, this imperfection, this is really beautiful because this is a sign that God is doing a work in this community. People are actually at church." And to look at it that way and to say, "Hey, all the little imperfect things are telling us that we're growing." And don't get on Google and rate the church. Don't get on Google. I would say this: don't even go on Google and give your church a 5-star rating, because that's still being consumeristic. I would say, just stay off of that. Keep it sacred. Keep holy things sacred. Don't treat your church like a brand. Don't treat it like something that we're going to talk about, like your favorite place to eat burgers. I look at it as a place where I go meet with God, hear the word of the Lord, and offer myself to serve the people of God. Keep it that way. Set it apart. Set it apart.
That's really good. Really good, Chris. I think our listeners just will appreciate some of your message. I heard, the keeping. I loved your phrase. We have to make sure we're weird. Like the church needs to be weird or different. I heard you saying, and so I heard.
Think about our story. We believe in a creator. We believe that he put us here on the earth, and we're told to love our enemies. And all of this is told to us by a guy who was nailed to a cross. I mean, this is a very odd story,
right? It's not a very Disney-esque thriller,
no,
is it?
It's definitely not.
So I'm just hearing this list, and I'm going to add one myself. So really serving at all costs, that's a way, calling people to that, telling stories of people doing that in your church, creating space of silence. Like I've just been in some church leaders of late where they are a more contemporary church, but they're creating some of these spaces for people to consider the big questions and what, even the preaching of God's word is done in the heart of the people while they're sitting there. Give them time to process it and think about it. So number 2, and then the accepting the imperfection, which I think will challenge a ton of our listeners who have our younger listeners have all been interns in churches like mine where we demanded excellence. Like it was just like, so there's this, I know, stirring that's probably going on in our listeners where they got to wrestle this out. No, imperfect is actually okay. I would add the thing we're really trying to rally people to. I would add this for church leaders. How do you get people to own personally the Great Commission and that they're on mission wherever they're going, thinking about how they share what Jesus has done in their own life with those who yet don't know him, that they have relationship with. And so that, traditionally using the word relational evangelism, that's one of our biggest things. Like part of how we break consumerism and die to self is I got to think about these people I'm interacting with in everyday life who don't know Jesus yet and may be open to a spiritual conversation and seeking, some of these weird things that we're talking about today. Thank you so much for taking time. I just appreciate your thoughts and insights. You used a bunch of words, man, that I wanted to pause and go, hey, I don't know what that word means. So that was kind of fun. And so, to our listeners, well, we just want to say thanks. And we've been taking a deep dive into this idea of radical alignment to the Great Commission. If you've been listening to some episodes and you're looking for kind of a next step, we've got a free ebook for you. It's less than a 15-minute read with some real practical tools you and your team can do. Just go to the intentionalchurches.com/podcast and you can download that free ebook and start using it with your team. Chris, thanks again for being with us. And we'll see you all next time, listeners.